The dust kicked up around Grace Fletcher's worn boots as she stumbled along the rutted road leading into Williamsburg, Texas, her arms burning from the weight of her 4-year-old son pressed against her chest. Little Thomas had been sick for 3 days now, his small body radiating heat like a stone left too long in the summer sun, and with each labored breath he took, Grace felt her own heart constrict with a fear she had never known before in all her 22 years. Her husband had been dead 6 months, killed in a mining accident up north, and she had traveled south to her sister's place only to find the homestead abandoned, leaving her alone on this desolate stretch of road with a child who might not survive another night without proper care. The July heat of 1878 bore down mercilessly, and Grace's dark hair clung to her sweat-dampened neck as she forced one foot in front of the other. Thomas whimpered against her shoulder, his small fingers clutching weakly at her faded calico dress. She had been walking since dawn, having spent what little money she had left on a stagecoach ticket that only took her halfway to Williamsburg, before the driver refused to go further without additional payment she could not provide. "Hold on, my sweet boy," she whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "Just hold on a little longer." The town could not be more than another mile ahead, but Grace's legs trembled with each step, threatening to give out beneath her. Her vision blurred at the edges, whether from the relentless sun or her own tears she could not tell. Thomas's breathing had grown more ragged, and she pressed her lips to his burning forehead, tasting salt and desperation. The sound of hoofbeats made her turn, nearly losing her balance as she did so. A rider approached from behind, sitting tall in his saddle atop a paint horse that looked well cared for despite the dust of the trail. As he drew closer, Grace could make out the man's features beneath the brim of his hat: strong jaw, sun-weathered skin, eyes the color of creek water reflecting sky. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. "Madam," he called out, slowing his horse as he neared her. His voice carried a note of concern that made something in Grace's chest tighten. "You look like you could use some help." Grace wanted to maintain her pride, to insist she could manage on her own, but Thomas chose that moment to let out a weak cough that shook his entire small frame. The sound seemed to cut through any pretense, and she found herself meeting the stranger's eyes with naked desperation. "My son," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He is burning with fever. I need to get him to a doctor, but I do not know if I can make it to town." The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. Up close, Grace could see the concern etched into his features as he approached, removing his hat respectfully. His movements were careful, unthreatening, as though he understood how vulnerable she must feel. "Name is Fletcher Owens," he said, his voice gentle despite his rough appearance. "I am heading into Williamsburg myself. The doctor there is a good man, trained back east. Let me take you both to him." Grace felt tears spill over her cheeks, relief washing through her so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. "Thank you," she managed. "I am Grace Fletcher, and this is Thomas." Fletcher's eyes widened slightly at her surname, a small smile touching his lips despite the seriousness of the situation. "Fletcher and Fletcher," he said softly. "That is either a strange coincidence or fate has a sense of humor." He moved to his horse, checking the saddle and adjusting the stirrups with practiced efficiency. "I am going to lift you both up first, if that is all right with you, madam. Then I will mount up behind. My horse can carry all 3 of us into town without trouble." Grace nodded, too exhausted and worried to protest. Fletcher's hands were gentle as he helped her into the saddle, careful not to jostle Thomas more than necessary. The little boy barely stirred, his head lolling against his mother's shoulder in a way that made Fletcher's jaw tighten with concern. Once Grace was settled, Fletcher mounted behind her in one smooth motion, his arms coming around both her and the child to take the reins. Grace found herself surrounded by his presence, his solid warmth at her back, his arms providing a protective barrier on either side. Under any other circumstances, such proximity to a strange man would have been scandalous, but desperation and fear overrode propriety. "Hold tight," Fletcher said near her ear, his breath stirring the loose strands of her hair. "We will be there soon." He urged his horse into a steady canter, fast enough to eat up the distance but not so reckless as to risk unseating his passengers. Grace leaned back against him without thinking, drawing strength from his solid presence. She had been alone for so long, carrying the weight of her grief and her responsibilities without help, that this sudden support felt almost overwhelming. "How long has the boy been sick?" Fletcher asked as they rode, his voice steady despite the movement of the horse. "3 days," Grace replied, having to raise her voice slightly to be heard. "It started as a cough, but then the fever came. He will not eat, can barely keep water down. I have tried everything I know, but nothing helps." "Doc Henderson will know what to do," Fletcher assured her. "He treated my sister's children when they had scarlet fever last winter. Did not lose a single one." The landscape rolled past in shades of brown and gold, sparse grass and scrub brush giving way gradually to more signs of civilization. They passed a farmstead, then another, and finally the first outlying buildings of Williamsburg came into view. The town was small but bustling, typical of settlements that had grown up around the cattle trade. Grace could see a main street lined with wooden buildings, their false fronts painted in fading colors, and people moving about their daily business despite the heat. Fletcher guided his horse straight down the main thoroughfare, ignoring the curious stares of townsfolk who watched them pass. Grace held Thomas tighter, whispering reassurances she prayed would prove true. The doctor's office sat near the center of town, identifiable by the painted sign hanging from its awning. Fletcher barely waited for his horse to stop before dismounting, then reaching up to help Grace down. "Let me carry him," Fletcher offered, his hands already extended toward Thomas. Grace hesitated only a moment before allowing Fletcher to take her son. The little boy looked even smaller cradled in the cowboy's strong arms, his face flushed with fever, his breathing labored. Fletcher's expression grew more grim as he felt the child's heat, and he moved quickly toward the doctor's door. The office was cooler than the street outside, shaded and smelling faintly of carbolic acid and herbs. A middle-aged man with graying hair and spectacles looked up from his desk, his expression shifting immediately from mild curiosity to professional concern as he took in the sight before him. "Doc Henderson," Fletcher said without preamble, "this boy needs help right away." The doctor was already on his feet, gesturing toward an examination table near the window. "Bring him here. How long has he been feverish?" "3 days," Grace answered, moving to stand beside the table as Fletcher laid Thomas down with surprising gentleness. "He coughs something terrible, and he cannot keep anything down." Doc Henderson began his examination, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he checked Thomas's pulse, listened to his breathing, examined his throat and ears. Grace watched every movement with desperate attention, trying to read the doctor's expression for clues about her son's condition. Fletcher stood slightly behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence like an anchor in a storm. "It is pneumonia," the doctor said finally, his tone serious but not without hope. "The boy's lungs are congested and the fever is quite high, but you got him here in time. With proper treatment, children his age usually recover, though it will not be easy or quick. Grace felt her legs go weak, and Fletcher's hand came to her elbow, steadying her. "What can be done?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I will need to start him on steam treatments immediately to help clear his lungs," Doc Henderson explained, already moving to gather supplies. "And I have a tonic that should help with the fever. He will need to stay here where I can monitor him closely. The next 48 hours will be critical." "I cannot pay," Grace blurted out, shame coloring her cheeks. "Not right away. My husband died and I have nothing left, but I swear I will find work and pay you back every cent." The doctor looked at her over his spectacles, his expression softening. "We will worry about payment later, Mrs. Fletcher. Right now, your son needs care, and that is what matters." Fletcher stepped forward. "Put the bill in my name, Doc. I will cover whatever is needed." Grace turned to stare at him, shocked. "I cannot ask you to do that. You do not even know us." "You are not asking," Fletcher replied, his creek water eyes meeting hers steadily. "I am offering. No child should suffer for lack of coins, and no mother should have to watch helplessly while her boy struggles for breath." Tears streamed down Grace's face, and she could not find words adequate to express her gratitude. Fletcher's hand was still at her elbow, warm and reassuring, and she found herself leaning into that support despite having known this man for less than an hour. Doc Henderson cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. Fletcher, I will need you to help me with the steam treatment. Mr. Owens, perhaps you could arrange for some boarding nearby. Mrs. Fletcher will need a place to rest when she is not sitting with her son." "The boarding house 2 doors down is run by Mrs. Sarah Montgomery," Fletcher said. "She is a good woman, fair and kind. I will speak with her." "I should stay with Thomas," Grace protested, not wanting to leave her son's side even for a moment. "And you will," the doctor assured her. "But you will be no good to him if you collapse from exhaustion. When was the last time you ate or rested properly?" Grace could not remember. The past days had blurred together in a haze of worry and motion. Fletcher's hand tightened slightly on her elbow, drawing her attention back to him. "Let me take care of the practical matters," he said quietly. "You focus on your boy. I will be back shortly." He left before Grace could protest further, and she turned her attention back to Thomas as Doc Henderson began preparing the steam treatment. The process involved a kettle of boiling water infused with medicinal herbs. The steam directed toward the child's face with a cloth tent to concentrate the vapors. Grace held Thomas's small hand as the doctor worked, whispering stories and songs, anything to comfort him even though she was not sure he could hear her through his feverish haze. Time seemed to lose meaning as they worked to ease Thomas's breathing. Doc Henderson showed Grace how to position the steam apparatus, how to check that the temperature was not too hot, how to monitor Thomas's response to the treatment. The little boy coughed and sputtered at first, but gradually his breathing seemed to ease slightly, becoming less labored. Fletcher returned perhaps an hour later, though it felt both longer and shorter to Grace. He entered quietly, removing his hat and approaching the table where Grace sat vigil. "Mrs. Montgomery has a room ready for you," he reported. "She will bring over some supper in a while, says you look like you need a good meal. I also stopped by the general store and picked up a few things I thought you might need." He held out a package wrapped in brown paper. Grace opened it with trembling hands to find a clean dress, undergarments, a hairbrush, and soap. Simple necessities that she had been without since selling most of her belongings to fund her journey south. "I cannot accept this," Grace protested weakly, even as her fingers curled around the soft fabric of the dress. "You have already done too much. You can accept it, and you will," Fletcher said firmly but kindly. What kind of man would I be if I left a lady in need without offering assistance? Besides, consider it a loan if you must. You can pay me back when you are able." Doc Henderson looked between them with an expression that might have been approval. "Mr. Owens, I could use your help with something if you have a few minutes. I need to move some supplies from the back room, and my back is not what it used to be." It was clearly a polite excuse to give Grace a moment of privacy, and she appreciated the doctor's tact. As the two men stepped into the back room, Grace allowed herself to slump slightly in her chair, the weight of the past days pressing down on her all at once. She looked at her son's flushed face, at the rise and fall of his small chest, and sent up a silent prayer of thanks that they had encountered Fletcher Owens on that dusty road. When Fletcher returned, he pulled up a chair beside her, sitting in companionable silence as they both watched Thomas breathe. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward evening, painting the room in shades of amber and gold. "Tell me about your husband," Fletcher said quietly after a while. "If you do not mind speaking of it." Grace was surprised by the question but found she did not mind. "James was a good man. Hard-working, honest. We married young, both of us barely 19. He took work in the silver mines up in Colorado, said he would make enough to buy us a proper farm. The cave-in happened in January. They sent me his personal effects and 2 months' wages." "I am sorry," Fletcher said, and the simple sincerity in his voice made it mean more than flowery condolences ever could. "What brought you to Texas?" Grace asked, wanting to shift the focus away from her grief. Fletcher leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "I work for the Triple Bar Ranch about 10 miles west of town. Came down from Kansas 2 years ago, was tired of the harsh winters up north. Texas has its challenges, but the land speaks to me somehow. Been saving my wages, hoping to buy my own spread someday." "That is a good dream," Grace said softly. "What about you?" Fletcher asked. "What will you do once Thomas is well?" The question made Grace's heart sink. She had been so focused on getting her son to help that she had not thought beyond that immediate crisis. "I suppose I will need to find work. I can cook and clean, take in laundry perhaps. Thomas is young, but he is a good boy, well behaved. I am hoping someone will take pity and give me a chance despite having a child to care for." Fletcher nodded thoughtfully but said nothing more. They sat together as the light faded, taking turns helping Doc Henderson with the steam treatments, monitoring Thomas's fever, trying to get small sips of water past his cracked lips. Mrs. Montgomery arrived with a tray of food as promised: thick beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie. She was a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "You eat every bite," she ordered Grace, setting the tray down on a side table. "And when you are ready to rest, your room is the second door on the left upstairs." I put fresh linens on the bed and left the window open to catch the evening breeze. "Thank you," Grace said, overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers. "I do not know how I will ever repay everyone's generosity." "Kindness is not a debt, child," Mrs. Montgomery replied. "It is just what decent folk do for one another. Now eat, before that stew gets cold." Fletcher insisted on staying through the evening, helping Doc Henderson with treatments while Grace tried to force down food her nervous stomach did not want. Thomas's fever remained high, but the doctor seemed cautiously optimistic that the worst could be avoided with continued care. As night fell properly, and lamps were lit around the office, Fletcher finally stood to take his leave. "I need to get back to the ranch. Let them know I will be in town for the next few days. I will return in the morning to check on Thomas." "You do not need to do that," Grace protested, though her heart lifted at the thought of seeing him again. "You have your work, and we have already taken up so much of your time." "I will be here in the morning," Fletcher repeated, his tone brooking no argument. He settled his hat back on his head, then paused, looking down at Grace with an expression that made her breath catch. "You are not alone anymore, Grace Fletcher. Remember that." He left before she could respond, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and Grace found herself staring at the closed door long after he had gone. Doc Henderson cleared his throat gently, a knowing smile playing at his lips. "That Fletcher Owens is a good man," the doctor said. "Honest, hardworking, treats everyone fair regardless of their station. His ranch foreman speaks highly of him, says he is the most reliable hand they have." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the warm evening. "He has been very kind." "Kind," Doc Henderson repeated with a chuckle. "Yes, I suppose that is one word for it. Now, Mrs. Fletcher, I want you to go get some proper rest. I will stay here with Thomas tonight, and I will send for you immediately if there is any change in his condition." "I cannot leave him," Grace said automatically. "You can and you must," the doctor replied firmly. "You will be no help to your son if you are too exhausted to stand. The boarding house is right next door. A few hours of real sleep will do you good, and I promise Thomas will be well cared for." Grace wanted to argue, but her body betrayed her with a jaw-cracking yawn. The doctor was right. She was running on fumes, had been for days. Reluctantly, she bent to kiss Thomas's forehead, whispering promises to return first thing in the morning, then gathered her package of new belongings and made her way next door. Mrs. Montgomery met her in the front hall, lamp in hand, and led her upstairs to a small but clean room. The bed looked impossibly inviting with its white sheets and plump pillows, and a basin of water sat on the washstand waiting for her. "Breakfast is at sunrise," Mrs. Montgomery said. "But if you sleep through, I will keep a plate warm for you. You just rest now, dear." Grace barely remembered washing her face and changing into the clean nightgown that had been included in Fletcher's package before she collapsed into the bed. Sleep claimed her immediately, pulling her down into darkness so complete that for the first time in days, she did not dream. She woke to pale morning light filtering through the curtains and the sound of birdsong outside her window. For a confused moment, she could not remember where she was, then everything came rushing back. Thomas's illness, the desperate walk, Fletcher Owens appearing like something out of a fever dream. Grace dressed quickly in her new dress, a simple blue calico that fit reasonably well despite being purchased by a man who could only guess at her size. Doc Henderson was just finishing another steam treatment when Grace burst into his office, her heart pounding with fear at what news the night might have brought. But the doctor smiled at her arrival, and Grace felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "He is holding steady," Doc Henderson reported. "The fever has not broken yet, but it has not climbed higher either. His breathing is a bit easier this morning. These are good signs." Grace approached the examination table where Thomas lay, his small face still flushed but perhaps not quite as alarmingly red as the day before. She took his hand, relieved to feel his fingers curl weakly around hers. "Mama," he whispered, his eyes fluttering open briefly. "I am here, sweet boy," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "You are going to be all right. The doctor is taking good care of you." She spent the morning helping Doc Henderson with treatments and trying to coax Thomas into taking small sips of broth. The little boy was more alert than he had been the previous day, which the doctor said was an encouraging sign. Around mid-morning the door opened and Fletcher walked in, his arms laden with packages. "Morning," he said, his eyes going first to Thomas, then to Grace. "How is the patient?" "Better," Grace replied, and realized as she said it that it was true. Thomas was far from recovered, but the immediate crisis seemed to have passed. Doc Henderson says we are through the worst of it, though it will still be several days before he is well enough to leave. Fletcher set his packages on a side table and approached the examination table. He looked down at Thomas with genuine care, and Grace felt something warm unfurl in her chest at the sight. "Glad to hear it," Fletcher said. "I brought some things I thought might help. Mrs. Chen at the restaurant sent over more broth, the good kind with vegetables and herbs, and I got these from the general store." He pulled out a small wooden horse and a rag doll, simple toys but clearly chosen with thought. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes again, seeming to cry more in the past day than she had in the 6 months since James's death. "You did not have to do that," she said softly. "I wanted to," Fletcher replied, his creek water eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. "Every boy needs a horse, even if it is just a toy one." Thomas's eyes had focused on the wooden horse with childlike interest, and he reached out one small hand toward it. Fletcher placed it carefully in the boy's grasp, and Thomas clutched it weakly, a ghost of a smile touching his fevered face. "What do you say, Thomas?" Grace prompted gently. "Thank you," the little boy whispered, his voice hoarse from coughing. "You are welcome, partner," Fletcher said, and Grace noticed he had to clear his throat as he said it. Doc Henderson excused himself to attend to other patients, leaving Grace and Fletcher alone with Thomas. They fell into an easy rhythm, working together to care for the child, talking quietly when he slept. Grace learned that Fletcher was 25, that he had grown up on a farm in Missouri, that he had 2 sisters and a brother, all still living back home. He talked about his dreams of having his own ranch someday, a place where he could raise cattle and horses, build something lasting. "What about a family?" Grace asked, then immediately felt her face heat at the forward nature of the question. "I apologize, that was inappropriate." Fletcher smiled, not seeming offended. "No need to apologize. Yes, I would like a family someday. A wife who does not mind the hard work of ranch life, children to pass the land on to. My mother used to say that a house is not a home without love and laughter filling it." "Your mother sounds wise," Grace said softly. "She is," Fletcher agreed. "I should write to her more often. She worries about me being so far from home." They were interrupted by Thomas stirring, another coughing fit taking hold. Grace helped him sit up, supporting his small back while Fletcher held a cup of water ready. When the coughing passed, Thomas looked exhausted, but his eyes were clearer than they had been. "Mama, I am hungry," he said, and Grace nearly cried with relief at those simple words. "That is wonderful, sweet boy. Let us see if you can keep down some broth." They spent the rest of the day in the doctor's office, monitoring Thomas's progress as he slowly improved. The fever began to break that evening, and though Doc Henderson warned that recovery would still take time, the worst was clearly behind them. Grace felt as though an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders, leaving her almost dizzy with relief. Fletcher stayed through dinner again, and afterward, he walked Grace back to the boarding house while Doc Henderson watched over the sleeping child. The evening air was cooler than it had been, carrying the scent of cooking fires and horses, the familiar smells of a frontier town settling in for the night. "I do not know how to thank you properly," Grace said as they stood outside the boarding house. "You saved Thomas's life. If you had not come along when you did—" "Do not think about what might have been," Fletcher interrupted gently. "Thomas is going to be fine. That is what matters." They stood in the gathering darkness, the space between them feeling charged with something Grace could not quite name. She was achingly aware of him, of his nearness, of the way the lamplight from the boarding house window cast shadows across his strong features. "Why did you do all this?" she asked softly. You could have just pointed us toward town and ridden on. Instead, you have spent your time and money helping strangers. Why?" Fletcher was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. "I do not rightly know how to explain it," he finally said. "When I saw you on that road, carrying your sick child, looking so desperate and determined all at once, something in me just knew I could not ride past. And then, spending time with you and Thomas these past days, seeing your strength and your love for your boy, I am glad I stopped. More glad than I can put into words." Grace's breath caught at the raw honesty in his voice. She knew she should step back, maintain proper distance, remember that she was a widow of only 6 months and this man was essentially a stranger. But standing there in the warm Texas night, looking up into Fletcher Owens's earnest face, propriety seemed very far away and unimportant. "I am glad too," she whispered. Fletcher reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered for just a moment against her cheek, and Grace felt that touch all the way to her bones. "Get some rest," he said, his voice rough. "I will see you in the morning." He turned and walked away into the darkness, and Grace watched until she could no longer distinguish his form from the shadows. She touched her cheek where his fingers had been, her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with fear or worry. The next few days fell into a pattern. Fletcher would arrive each morning, often bringing small gifts or treats for Thomas, and spend most of the day helping Grace care for the recovering child. Doc Henderson approved of the arrangement, noting that Thomas seemed to brighten when Fletcher was around, responding to the cowboy's gentle humor and patient attention. Thomas's recovery was steady if slow. The fever broke completely on the 3rd day, and by the 4th, he was sitting up on his own, playing with his wooden horse and chattering in the way healthy 4-year-olds do. Grace could finally breathe easily again, the constant knot of fear in her chest unwinding. As Thomas improved, Grace became more aware of her growing feelings for Fletcher. She found herself watching for his arrival each morning, her heart lifting when he walked through the door. She noticed small things about him. The way he pushed his hair back when he was thinking, the laugh lines around his eyes, the gentleness of his hands despite their calluses and scars. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations flowing as easily as water. Fletcher seemed equally drawn to her. Grace caught him watching her when he thought she was not looking, his expression soft and wondering. Their hands would brush accidentally, and neither would pull away quite as quickly as propriety demanded. The air between them hummed with possibility, with feelings neither had quite spoken aloud. On the 5th day, Doc Henderson declared Thomas well enough to leave the office, though he would need continued rest and care for several more weeks before he was fully recovered. The news brought mixed feelings for Grace. She was overjoyed that her son was healing, but she also knew this meant facing the practical realities she had been able to ignore while Thomas was so ill. She needed to find work and housing, needed to figure out how to support herself and her child in a town where she knew no one. "What will you do now?" Fletcher asked as they walked back to the boarding house, Thomas content in his mother's arms despite the short distance. "I need to find employment," Grace said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I was thinking of asking around town tomorrow, seeing if anyone needs help with cooking or cleaning." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, and when Grace looked at him, his expression was troubled. "I have a proposition for you," he said slowly, "and I want you to hear me out before you answer." Grace felt her stomach flip with nervousness. "All right. The Triple Bar Ranch where I work, we have been without a proper cook since old Mrs. Rivera went back to Mexico to be with her daughter. The hands have been taking turns trying to make meals, and let me tell you, Cowboys are not known for their culinary skills. The foreman, Bill Thompson, has been complaining about it for weeks. He paused, and Grace waited, sensing there was more. The ranch has a small house that the cook used to live in, separate from the bunkhouse. 2 rooms, a good stove, a well nearby. It is not fancy, but it is sturdy and clean. If you were willing to take on the cooking for the ranch hands, you would have a place to live and a steady wage. Thomas could stay with you, and there is even a small school in the area for when he is old enough. Grace stared at him, hardly daring to hope. "Are you serious?" "Completely," Fletcher said. "I already spoke to Bill about it, told him I knew someone who might be interested. He said if you can cook decent food and do not mind a bunch of rough cowboys, the job is yours." "I can cook," Grace said, her mind racing. "My mother taught me, and I have been keeping house since I was young. But are you certain?" Taking on a woman with a young child, that is a lot to ask of an employer. "Bill has 5 children of his own," Fletcher replied with a smile. "He does not mind kids. In fact, his wife Catherine has been wanting another woman around, says she gets tired of only having male company." It was perfect, too perfect. Grace felt suspicion creep in despite her hope. "Why are you doing this? First you pay for Thomas's doctor bills, now you are arranging employment for me. What do you want in return?" The words came out harsher than she intended, but 6 months of widowhood and poverty had taught her that nothing came without a price. Fletcher stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I want nothing except to see you and Thomas safe and settled," he said, his voice earnest. "Grace, I know you have no reason to trust me beyond what we have shared these past days. I know you have been hurt and left alone to struggle. But I swear to you, I am offering this help freely, with no expectations or demands. You would be doing honest work for honest pay, nothing more." Grace searched his face, looking for deception or hidden motives, but found only sincerity. She thought about her options: staying in town, taking in laundry or scrubbing floors, living in a cramped room and leaving Thomas with strangers while she worked. Or accepting this offer, having a home and work that would allow her to keep her son close, being part of a community even if it was a rough one. "When would I start?" she asked quietly. Fletcher's face broke into a genuine smile that made him look younger, almost boyish. "Whenever you are ready. I told Bill that Thomas needs more recovery time, so there is no rush. But the sooner you can come, the happier the hands will be. Some of them have been threatening mutiny over Hank's attempts at biscuits." Despite her nerves, Grace found herself laughing. "Very well, I accept with gratitude. But I insist on paying back the money you spent on the doctor bills and my clothes. It may take time, but I will repay every cent." "If it makes you feel better to do so, I will not argue," Fletcher said. "Though truly, I consider it money well spent." They continued to the boarding house, where Mrs. Montgomery greeted them with delight at seeing Thomas looking so much better. Over supper, Grace told the landlady about the job offer, and Mrs. Montgomery beamed. "That is wonderful news, dear. The Triple Bar is a good outfit, fair and honest. You will do well there. And Fletcher Owens," she added with a knowing look at the cowboy, "I am sure he will make certain you settle in comfortably." Fletcher's ears reddened slightly, but he did not deny it. They lingered over the meal, talking and laughing, and Grace realized she had not felt this light, this hopeful, since before James's death. Guilt tried to creep in at that realization, but she pushed it away. James was gone, and she was still here, still living, still responsible for raising their son. He would not have wanted her to wallow in grief forever. Over the next week, Grace and Thomas continued to stay at the boarding house while the little boy regained his strength. Fletcher visited every day, often bringing other ranch hands into town with him so Grace could meet them. They were a motley crew of cowboys, ranging from boys barely old enough to shave to grizzled men who had spent decades in the saddle. To a man, they treated Grace with respect and were surprisingly gentle with Thomas, letting the little boy pet their horses and telling him exaggerated stories about life on the range. Grace grew more confident in her decision to accept the position. The men were rough but kind, and they spoke highly of the Thompson family who ran the ranch. Bill Thompson himself came into town to meet Grace, a barrel-chested man in his 40s with a booming laugh and shrewd but kind eyes. His wife Catherine accompanied him, a petite woman with graying hair and a warm smile. "Fletcher tells us you are a widow," Catherine said gently as they sat in Mrs. Montgomery's parlor. "I am sorry for your loss. It cannot have been easy managing on your own with a small child." "It has been difficult," Grace admitted, "but I am grateful for the opportunity your husband is offering. I promise I will work hard and earn my keep." "I have no doubt of that," Catherine replied. "Any woman who can walk miles in the heat carrying a sick child has more than enough determination for ranch life. And I will enjoy having another woman to talk to. The ranch can feel isolated sometimes." They discussed the practical details. Grace would prepare 3 meals a day for the ranch hands, do basic baking and preserving when supplies allowed, and keep the cookhouse clean. In return, she would have the small house, a monthly wage, and a portion of the ranch's produce and meat. It was more than fair, more than Grace had dared to hope for. "When can you start?" Bill asked. Grace looked at Thomas, who was playing quietly in the corner with his wooden horse. The little boy still tired easily, but his energy was returning day by day. "Another week, perhaps." "I want to be certain Thomas is strong enough for the move." "A week it is," Bill agreed, shaking her hand with a grip that was firm but careful of her smaller hand. "We will have the house cleaned and ready for you." After the Thompsons left, Fletcher stayed behind, as had become his habit. Thomas had grown attached to the cowboy, demanding that Mr. Fletcher read him stories or play with him whenever possible. Fletcher bore this attention with good humor, his patience with the child seemingly endless. "You are good with him," Grace observed as she watched Fletcher help Thomas build a tower out of wooden blocks borrowed from Mrs. Montgomery's grandson. "I like children," Fletcher replied, carefully balancing another block on the precarious structure. "They are honest in a way adults often are not. What they feel they show, what they think they say." "Do you want children of your own someday?" Grace asked, then wondered if she was being too forward again. Fletcher's eyes met hers over Thomas's bent head. "Yes," he said simply. "Someday. With the right woman." There was something in his gaze that made Grace's breath catch, a warmth and intention that could not be misinterpreted. She looked away first, heat rising to her cheeks, but she was smiling. The tower collapsed with Thomas's delighted laughter, breaking the moment, but Grace felt the truth of it humming in her bones. Something was growing between her and Fletcher Owens, something that went beyond gratitude or convenience. She had loved James, would always carry a piece of that love with her. But James was gone, and Fletcher was here, solid and real and looking at her like she was something precious. The week passed quickly. Thomas continued to grow stronger, running around Mrs. Montgomery's yard and eating with the appetite of a healthy child. Grace used the time to prepare for her new position, purchasing supplies she would need and learning what she could about ranch cooking from Catherine Thompson, who visited twice more before the move. Fletcher helped with everything, arranging for a wagon to transport Grace's few belongings, purchasing additional items she would need for the house, introducing her to more of the ranch community. His attentiveness went far beyond what could be explained by simple kindness, and Grace knew the other ranch hands had noticed. She heard their teasing comments to Fletcher when they thought she was out of earshot, saw their knowing grins when he helped her into the wagon or carried Thomas on his shoulders. The day of the move arrived warm and clear. Grace packed her few possessions, including the dress and items Fletcher had bought her that first desperate day. Mrs. Montgomery hugged her goodbye, pressing a jar of preserves into her hands as a parting gift. "You come visit whenever you are in town," the landlady said. "And you take care of that boy." "I will," Grace promised. "Thank you for everything." The ride to the Triple Bar Ranch took about 2 hours along a well-maintained road. Fletcher drove the wagon while Grace sat beside him. Thomas nestled between them, chattering excitedly about getting to see the ranch. The landscape rolled past in shades of gold and green, the grassland dotted with cattle bearing the Triple Bar brand. The ranch itself was more substantial than Grace had expected. The main house was a sprawling structure with a wide porch, clearly added onto over the years as the Thompson family grew. Beyond it stood the bunkhouse, stables, barn, and various outbuildings. And set slightly apart, connected to the main cookhouse by a covered walkway, was the small house that would be Grace's new home. Catherine Thompson came out to meet them, wiping her hands on her apron. "Welcome, welcome," she called. "Let me show you around." The house was indeed small, just 2 rooms as Fletcher had said, but it was clean and well maintained. The main room served as kitchen and living space, with a good iron stove, a table and chairs, and even a rocking chair by the window. The second room held a bed, a wardrobe, and a small cot that Catherine explained her husband had added for Thomas. "I know it is not much," Catherine said, "but it is yours for as long as you work here. We have bedding and dishes stored that were Mrs. Rivera's." She said to give them to whoever took over her position. "It is wonderful," Grace said honestly, running her hand over the smooth wood of the table. "Better than I hoped for." Fletcher and Bill carried in Grace's belongings, which took very little time given how few possessions she had. Thomas immediately claimed the small cot as his, arranging his wooden horse carefully on the pillow. Catherine left them to settle in, promising to return for supper so they could discuss the kitchen routine. When it was just the 3 of them, Fletcher looked around the small space with satisfaction. "What do you think?" he asked Grace. "I think I am incredibly fortunate," she replied, "and I think I have you to thank for that." "You would have found your way regardless," Fletcher said. "You are strong, Grace, stronger than you know." Thomas tugged at Fletcher's pant leg. "Are you going to stay here with us, Mr. Fletcher?" The innocent question hung in the air, loaded with implications neither adult could ignore. Fletcher crouched down to Thomas's level. "I live in the bunkhouse with the other cowboys," he explained gently. "But I will be around a lot, especially at mealtimes. You will see me plenty, partner." "Oh," Thomas said, clearly disappointed. "I wish you could stay." "Thomas," Grace said, embarrassed, "Mr. Fletcher has his own home." "It is all right," Fletcher assured her, ruffling Thomas's hair. "I wish I could stay too, partner, but I will visit every day, I promise." He stood, his eyes meeting Grace's with an intensity that made her heart race. "I should get back to work. Bill will have my hide if I slack off too much. But if you need anything at all, you send word." "I will," Grace promised. "And Fletcher, thank you for everything." He smiled, touching his hat brim in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "My pleasure, Grace Fletcher." After he left, Grace stood in her new home, holding Thomas's hand, and felt hope bloom in her chest like a flower reaching for sun. This was a new beginning, a chance to build a life for herself and her son. And if that life happened to include a certain kind-eyed cowboy, well, she was not opposed to that possibility. She set to work making the house truly theirs, unpacking their few belongings, arranging the dishes in the cabinet, hanging James's photograph on the wall where she could see it, but it would not dominate the space. She was a widow, but she was also young and alive, with a future that suddenly looked brighter than it had in months. Catherine returned as promised, and they spent the evening discussing the kitchen routine. Grace would prepare breakfast at dawn, have dinner ready at midday, and supper in the evening. The ranch ran on a predictable schedule which would make meal planning easier. Catherine showed her the larder, well stocked with basics, and the smokehouse where preserved meats hung. "The men eat a lot," Catherine warned with a laugh, "but they are appreciative of good food. Mrs. Rivera spoiled them with her cooking, so you have high standards to meet." "I will do my best," Grace promised. That night, lying in her new bed with Thomas asleep on his cot nearby, Grace listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Horses whickered in the stables, someone played a harmonica in the distance, crickets sang their evening song. It was so different from the town she had lived in, from the mining camp where James had worked, from anywhere she had been before. But as she drifted off to sleep, she found she liked these new sounds, this new place. And when she dreamed, it was of creek water eyes and gentle hands, of a future she was only beginning to imagine. Grace rose before dawn the next morning, determined to prove herself worthy of the opportunity she had been given. She lit the lamps in the cookhouse, stoked the fire in the massive stove, and began preparing breakfast. She made biscuits from memory, using her mother's recipe, and fried thick slices of bacon, scrambled dozens of eggs, made gravy, and put coffee on to boil. The ranch hands began filing in as the sun painted the eastern sky pink and gold. They came hungry and half awake, settling onto the benches at the long tables with little ceremony. Fletcher was among them, his hair still damp from washing at the pump, and his eyes found Grace immediately, warming with a smile. Grace served the food, nervous about their reaction. The men ate in silence at first, focused on their plates, and she held her breath waiting for judgment. Then one of the older hands, a grizzled man called Pete, looked up with an expression of pure bliss. "Madam, these are the best biscuits I have had since my mother passed 10 years ago," he said. "Light as clouds and twice as heavenly." A murmur of agreement ran through the assembled cowboys, and Grace felt relief wash over her. "I am glad you enjoy them," she said, trying not to show how nervous she had been. "Enjoy them." Another hand, a young man named Danny, laughed. "Madam, if you keep cooking like this, we might actually start gaining weight instead of wasting away on the slop we have been eating." The men laughed, and the tension broke completely. They ate with genuine appetite, and Grace found herself smiling as she refilled coffee cups and brought out more biscuits. This was work she knew, work she could do well, and there was satisfaction in seeing people enjoy what she had made. Fletcher lingered after the other hands had left for their morning tasks, helping Grace clear the tables. "They like you," he said. "I knew they would." "They like my cooking," Grace corrected, but she was pleased nonetheless. "That too," Fletcher agreed. "But you should have heard them talking last night after we left you. Half of them are already planning to be on their best behavior, worried you might leave if they are too rough." Grace laughed at the image of these hardened cowboys worrying about their manners. "I am not that delicate. I have lived in mining camps and frontier towns. A little rough language will not send me running." "Even so, it is nice that they care," Fletcher said. He hesitated, then added, "Grace, I know you will be busy, but I was wondering if you might want some company when you take Thomas out exploring later. I could show you around the ranch properly, introduce you to some of the horses." "Thomas would love that," Grace said, then added more softly, "and so would I." Fletcher's smile could have lit the dim cookhouse. After midday meal, then, I will come find you." He left with a touch to his hat brim, and Grace returned to her work with a lightness in her step. She cleaned the cookhouse, returned to her little house to check on Thomas, who was still sleeping, and began preparing for the midday meal. The work was hard but satisfying, and she found herself humming as she rolled out dough for pies. The days fell into a rhythm. Grace cooked, cared for Thomas, and slowly explored her new home. Fletcher was a constant presence, always finding reasons to stop by, to help with heavy lifting, to play with Thomas, to steal moments of conversation with Grace. The other hands teased him mercilessly about his attention to the new cook, but Fletcher bore it with good humor. As the weeks passed, Thomas regained all his strength and more. He was a bright, curious child who charmed everyone on the ranch. Bill Thompson's children, ranging from 12 to 19, took him under their collective wing, teaching him to feed chickens and spot cattle in the distance. Catherine Thompson became a friend to Grace, visiting often and sharing the quiet companionship of women's work. But it was Fletcher who occupied Grace's thoughts more and more. She found herself watching for him, listening for his voice, saving small jokes or observations to share with him later. The attraction she had felt from the beginning had deepened into something more substantial. She admired his kindness, his work ethic, the way he treated everyone with respect regardless of their position. She loved his laugh, the way he pushed his hair back when thinking, the gentleness of his hands despite the rough work they did. And Fletcher made no secret of his growing feelings for her. He brought her wildflowers he found on the range, helped Thomas catch fireflies in the evening, sat with her on her small porch after supper talking until the stars came out. He never pushed, never demanded more than she was ready to give, but his intentions were clear. 2 months after Grace arrived at the Triple Bar, Fletcher asked her to walk with him after supper. Catherine had offered to watch Thomas, who was already half asleep from a day of playing with the Thompson children. Grace agreed, curiosity and anticipation fluttering in her stomach. They walked away from the buildings, following a path that led to a small creek that ran through the property. The evening was warm, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple as the sun set. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, just enjoying each other's presence. "Grace," Fletcher finally said, stopping near a large cottonwood tree that grew beside the creek. "I need to tell you something, and I hope it does not make things awkward between us." Grace's heart began to race. "What is it?" Fletcher took a deep breath, then met her eyes directly. "I am in love with you. I think I started falling that first day on the road when you looked at me with such desperate hope, trusting a complete stranger with your child's life. And every day since, I have fallen a little more. The way you love Thomas, the way you work so hard, the way you laugh, the way you look at sunrise when you think no one is watching, all of it. I love all of it." Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "Fletcher, I know it is too soon," he continued quickly. "I know you are still mourning your husband, and I respect that. I am not asking you to feel the same way right now. I just needed you to know where I stand, what my intentions are. I want to court you properly, Grace Fletcher. I want to build a life with you and Thomas. I want to buy that land I have been saving for and build you a house, a real home where you can put down roots and never have to worry about being alone or scared again." "It is not too soon," Grace whispered, reaching out to take his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. "I love James, and I will always honor his memory, but he is gone and you are here. You have shown me more kindness and care in these past months than I knew how to hope for. You have been good to my son, treating him like he matters, like he is precious. How could I not love you for that alone? But it is more than gratitude, Fletcher. I have fallen in love with you too. With your kindness, your strength, the way you make me laugh, the way you see me not as a burden to bear or a duty to fulfill, but as someone worthwhile on my own." Fletcher's face transformed with joy, and he raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with such tenderness that Grace felt it in her soul. "May I court you then, properly?" "Yes," Grace said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, please." Fletcher pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and Grace let herself lean into his embrace, feeling safe and cherished in a way she had not since before James's death. They stood that way for a long time, holding each other as the creek burbled past, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. When they finally pulled apart, Fletcher kept one arm around her shoulders as they walked slowly back toward the ranch buildings. "I know we should take this slow," he said. "Court properly for a respectable amount of time. But Grace, I have to tell you, waiting is going to be torture." Grace laughed, the sound bubbling up from pure happiness. "We have time," she said. "All the time we need. I am not going anywhere." "Good," Fletcher said firmly. "Because I plan to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on a cowboy who happened along a dusty road." Their courtship became the subject of much discussion and approval among the ranch community. Catherine Thompson was delighted, declaring she had known from the start that Fletcher and Grace were meant for each other. The ranch hands treated the developing romance with surprising gentleness, making sure to give the couple space when they could while still teasing Fletcher mercilessly in private. Thomas was perhaps the happiest of all. The little boy adored Fletcher and had been asking increasingly pointed questions about why Mr. Fletcher could not live with them. When Grace explained that Mr. Fletcher was courting her and might someday be part of their family, Thomas's joy was uncontained. Fletcher continued to save his wages with new urgency, planning for the future he could now see clearly. He showed Grace the piece of land he hoped to buy, a beautiful stretch of property with good water and grass, room enough for cattle and horses and a family. They stood together on a rise overlooking the land, Thomas running ahead to investigate a prairie dog hole, and talked about the house they would build, the life they would create. "How many children do you want?" Grace asked, feeling bold. Fletcher grinned. "As many as you are willing to give me." "I always wanted a big family. But honestly, I will be happy with whatever we are blessed with. You and Thomas are already more than I deserve." "That is not true," Grace said firmly. "You deserve everything good, Fletcher Owens, and I intend to spend a very long time making sure you know that." He kissed her then, sweet and gentle, and Grace felt the last pieces of her heart that she had been holding back, protecting, finally settle into place. This was right. This was where she was meant to be. As fall approached, Fletcher made his offer on the land and it was accepted. The purchase took most of his savings, but he did not care. This was the foundation of their future. He began building a house on the property, working every spare moment with help from the other ranch hands who turned out in force to assist. The structure rose quickly, a solid 2-story home with a wide porch and enough rooms for the family Fletcher and Grace planned to have. In November, with the house nearly finished, and Grace having been at the Triple Bar for 4 months, Fletcher proposed properly. He took her back to the cottonwood tree by the creek where they had first confessed their love, got down on one knee, and offered her a simple gold band he had commissioned from the jeweler in town. "Grace Fletcher," he said, looking up at her with his creek water eyes full of love and hope, "will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life loving you and Thomas, building a home with you, growing old beside you?" "Yes," Grace said through happy tears. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They married in December, a small ceremony in the Williamsburg church with the Thompson family and the ranch hands in attendance. Thomas served as ring-bearer, taking his duty very seriously, and Catherine stood up with Grace while Bill stood with Fletcher. It was simple and perfect, and when Fletcher kissed his bride, the assembled crowd cheered. They moved into their new house immediately, and Grace delighted in having a real home of her own. She kept her position cooking for the ranch hands, now riding in with Fletcher each morning, and Catherine helped watch Thomas during the day. The arrangement worked well for everyone, and Grace loved the work that had given her independence and purpose during her hardest time. That first winter in their new home was cold but wonderful. They had supplies laid in. The house was warm and solid, and being together as a family felt like a dream Grace had not dared to imagine just months before. Fletcher was an attentive husband, thoughtful and loving, and Thomas flourished with a father figure in his life again. In the spring, Grace discovered she was expecting a child. Fletcher was overjoyed, immediately becoming even more protective and solicitous. Thomas was excited about becoming a big brother, though he had many questions about how babies worked that left both his parents laughing and scrambling for age-appropriate answers. "You hope for a boy or a girl?" Grace asked Fletcher one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset. "I do not care even a little bit," Fletcher said honestly, his hand resting on her still flat stomach. "As long as you and the baby are healthy, that is all that matters to me." Their daughter was born in early October of 1879, a year and 3 months after Grace had first stumbled into Williamsburg, carrying her sick child. They named her Hope, because that was what Fletcher had given Grace when she needed it most. Hope Owens was a healthy, loud baby with her father's eyes and her mother's dark hair, and Thomas took his role as big brother very seriously. Life settled into a happy rhythm. Fletcher's small ranch grew slowly but steadily, and with Grace's careful management of their finances and her continued income from cooking, they began to prosper. Thomas started attending the small local school when he turned 5, proving bright and eager to learn. Hope grew from infant to toddler to a little girl with more energy than seemed possible in such a small person. 2 years after Hope's birth, Grace gave birth to a son they named James, after her first husband, with Fletcher's full blessing. Fletcher had never felt threatened by James Fletcher's memory, understanding that Grace's ability to love him did not diminish what she had felt for her first husband. Young James had his father Fletcher's smile and his mother's determination, and he completed their family perfectly. The years passed in a blur of work and love and laughter. The ranch continued to grow until Fletcher could hire hands of his own, becoming a respected rancher in the area. Grace eventually stopped cooking for the Triple Bar when managing her own household with 3 children became too demanding. But she remained close friends with Catherine Thompson until the older woman's death many years later. Thomas grew into a fine young man, attending school and then learning the ranch business from Fletcher, who treated him in every way as his own son. Hope and James grew up wild and free, learning to ride almost before they could walk, working alongside their parents and older brother. The little house on the land Fletcher had bought expanded over the years, adding rooms as needed, becoming a true home filled with the love and laughter his mother had told him was necessary. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Fletcher and Grace stood on the porch of their home, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Thomas had married a local girl and given them 2 grandchildren already, with another on the way. Hope and James were both courting seriously, marriages likely on the horizon. "You ever think about that day on the road?" Fletcher asked, pulling Grace close against his side. They were both in their 50s now, with gray threading through their hair and lines earned by years of work and laughter marking their faces. When I came across you carrying Thomas, all the time, Grace admitted. I was so desperate, so scared. I thought my life was over, that I would lose everything that mattered. Instead, you found me, Fletcher said with a smile. Instead, I found you, Grace agreed, rising on her toes to kiss him. My savior, my love, my home. Sometimes I think I must have dreamed you, that no one real could be as good as you have been to me. I am real, Fletcher assured her, holding her close. And you made me better than I ever would have been without you. You and Thomas and our children. You are everything I never knew to dream about wanting. They stood together watching the sun set over the land they had built their life on, surrounded by the evidence of their love in the form of children and grandchildren, prosperity earned through hard work and careful planning, a home that had sheltered and nurtured a family for over 2 decades. Grace thought back to that desperate walk down a dusty road, to the moment a cowboy on a paint horse had stopped and offered help to a stranger. She had been carrying her sick child, alone and afraid, and Fletcher had taken them both to the doctor, starting a chain of events that led to this perfect moment. She had been at her lowest point, and he had appeared like an answer to prayers she had been too frightened to speak aloud. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. "For what?" Fletcher asked, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "For stopping that day, for not riding past, for seeing me when I was invisible to everyone else, for loving me and Thomas, for giving us this beautiful life." "Grace," Fletcher said, his voice thick with emotion, "you do not need to thank me for loving you. It has been the greatest privilege and joy of my life. That day on the road, I thought I was helping a woman in need. I had no idea I was meeting my future, my home, my heart." They held each other as the stars began to appear, as they had so many times over the years, still as in love as they had been in those early days of their courtship. The house behind them glowed with lamplight and rang with the voices of their family. The land around them was theirs, earned and built and nurtured into something lasting. Grace had been a widow with a sick child, desperate and alone on a dusty Texas road in the summer of 1878. Fletcher had been a cowboy with dreams of his own ranch and a heart open enough to stop and help a stranger. Together, they had built something neither could have managed alone: a family, a home, a love that had weathered 25 years and would last the rest of their lives. As they finally turned to go inside, joining their family for the anniversary celebration that awaited, Grace looked up at her husband and smiled. The desperate fear of that long-ago day had transformed into this abundance of joy and love. The cowboy who had taken them to the doctor had become her husband, her partner, her great love. And she knew, with the certainty that came from a lifetime of evidence, that she would never stop being grateful for the moment Fletcher Owens had decided to stop his horse and offer help to a woman carrying her sick child down a lonely road. That single act of kindness had changed everything, had given her a life beyond what she had ever dreamed possible. Their story, which had begun with desperation and fear, had become one of love and hope and family. And as they stepped into their warm, bright home surrounded by the people they loved most, Grace knew that this was what happily ever after looked like. Not perfect, not without challenges, but filled with love and partnership, and the deep satisfaction of a life well lived together. The end had become a beginning, and the beginning had led to this. A love story written in the dust of Texas roads and the hard work of building a life, a family, a legacy. Grace and Fletcher Owens had found each other when both needed it most, and they had spent every day since proving that love, real love, was worth every risk, every leap of faith, every moment of vulnerability. And they lived out the rest of their days in that home they had built together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren, their love story becoming the stuff of family legend. The tale of how Grandmother Grace had been carrying her sick child and Grandfather Fletcher had taken them both to the doctor, and how that single act of kindness had blossomed into a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth cherishing. And every time it was told, the listeners would sigh with satisfaction, knowing they were hearing about something real and true and lasting. A love that had conquered fear, poverty, loss, and loneliness to create something beautiful that would echo through generations. The kind of love that reminded everyone who heard about it that kindness matters, that taking a chance on helping a stranger might change your whole life, that happy endings were possible even when things seemed darkest. Grace and Fletcher knew they had been blessed beyond measure. They had found each other, built a life together, raised a family, and loved each other through everything life threw at them. And when they were very old, sitting together on that same porch watching yet another sunset, they would still hold hands like newlyweds, still look at each other with love that had only deepened over the decades, still grateful for that dusty road where their story began.